The whole town was burning wood that night. Every chimney in Hollow's End coughed smoke into a sky that gave nothing back, and still the cold won. But a mile out, on a hill no one wanted, there was no chimney roaring, no stacked cords of pine, only a thin gray thread of smoke rising slow and steady from the snow itself. Beneath that snow, behind a low wooden door, an old woman slept. Warm, unafraid. Her name was Maren Holloway. 63 winters had carved her hands into something hard and patient. Beside her, an old dog breathed soft and even in the dark. They had laughed at her once. The rich man, the builder, the whole shivering town. A widow with a shovel and a half-blind dog, scratching a hole into frozen ground like an animal too foolish to die indoors. They were not laughing now. Up the hill they would come, when the worst storm in living memory finally broke the proud houses below. They would climb through the dark, carrying their children, begging at the door of the woman they had thrown away. And the strangest part of all, she had known this hill could save them long before they ever did. She simply waited. But to understand the woman on the hill, you have to go back. Back before the smoke and the snow. Back before the whole valley climbed through a storm to reach her door. Back to when she was nobody at all. Back to when she still believed what they all believed. Because not so long ago, Maren Holloway had lived the way they all did. A proper house, square walls, a good roof. A stove in the middle of the front room that her husband had been so proud of. He used to say a house like that could outlast anything. She had believed him. She had no reason not to. But a house can look strong and still be hollow at the heart. One winter, the cold came in low and quiet. It did not break the door down. It did not have to. It came through the seams nobody could see. A thread of it here, a breath of it there. Her husband took a chill that would not leave. He sat by that stove every night, closer and closer, holding his hands out to the flame. And every night, the room stayed cold in the corners. The fire burned, the wood ran low. The cold simply waited. By the time the thaw came, the house was empty except for her and the dog. They buried him on a gray morning when the ground had only just softened enough to take him. After that, there were papers to sign. Debts that did not care about grief. A house that suddenly cost more to keep than it was worth. When it was all settled, Maren Holloway was left with very little. A few coins, an old dog named Ember, gray around the muzzle, one eye gone cloudy, who had been with her longer than most marriages last, and a hard, quiet lesson she could not stop turning over in her mind. A house can stand tall and proud, and still fail the people inside it. The town felt sorry for her at first. That was the worst part. They brought bread. They brought pity in their eyes. They lowered their voices when she walked by, the way people do around someone they have already decided is finished. The widow Holloway. Poor thing. No husband, no money, just that ragged old dog. She heard all of it. She said nothing. By the time the snow melted, she had stopped looking for another house. She could not afford one, and more than that, she no longer trusted one. So she walked. She walked the edges of the valley with Ember at her heel, looking at the land the way nobody else bothered to. The slopes, the rock, the way the wind moved across open ground and where it didn't. And one bitter morning, On that low hill the settlers had passed over for years. The dog began to dig. She almost called him off. The ground there was frozen hard enough to ring like stone. There was nothing on that hill but stubborn grass and wind that never seemed to leave. But Ember would not stop. He dug at one patch. She pulled him away. He went back. 10 minutes later, the same spot. The same frozen ground. By midday, she finally climbed up to see what had gotten into him. She knelt beside the hole he had opened. She pulled off one glove, and she pressed her bare hand flat against the dark soil he had uncovered. The surface was ice, but underneath, something was different. Not warm exactly, just not as cruel, not as hungry as the air above it. There was a smell too, dry, deep, old earth that the wind had never touched. For a long moment, Maren Holloway did not move. The dog watched her. The wind pulled at her coat, and somewhere in the back of her mind, an old memory turned over. A man she'd known long ago, before any of this. A man who had spent half his life digging passages through cold mountains. Silas Hadley, they'd called him. He used to say something she had never forgotten. Winter only takes what's fool enough to stand out in the open. She had thought it was just talk. Kneeling there now, with her bare hand against ground that refused to freeze all the way through, it didn't sound like talk anymore. She looked at the hill. For the first time, it did not look dead to her. It looked like a door. The next morning, she spent nearly the last of what she had. A used shovel with a worn handle. A pickaxe with a chip in the blade. When she counted the coins left in her palm afterward, there were not many. She closed her fingers around them, slow, and felt exactly how little stood between her and nothing. Then she carried the tools up the hill. And she began to dig, straight into the slope. One swing, then another, then another. The frozen ground fought her for every inch. The shock of it ran up through her wrists and into her shoulders. By the end of that first hour, her arms were shaking. She kept going. The dog lay near the opening, watching her, his breath fogging in the cold. Word travels fast in a small town. Faster than wisdom, usually. By the third day, half of Hollow's End had heard about the widow carving a hole into a frozen hill like an animal preparing to den up for the winter. When she came down for a few more supplies, the laughter found her quick. Thaddeus Crane, the richest man in the valley, the one who sold most of the wood the town burned. He laughed first, loud, from deep in his chest, the kind of laugh meant to be heard by everyone. 60 years old, he said, and she's gone and lost her mind out on that hill. A few men joined in. Near the warehouse stove, Garrett Becker watched without smiling. He was the finest builder in the valley, and he did not laugh, but his words landed just as hard. "That slope will come down on top of you, Maren," he said. "First good thaw. You mark me." The minister, Eliphalet Stowe, only shook his head, slow and certain. "A decent woman belongs under a proper roof," he said, "not living in the dirt like something wild." Maren Holloway looked at all of them. She did not argue. She paid for her rope. She picked up a torn scrap of tarp nobody else wanted. She whistled once for Ember, and she walked back out toward her hill, into the wind, while the laughter faded behind her. That evening, long after the town had gone quiet, the sound of metal striking earth still carried across the dark valley. One swing, then another, The frozen hill did not care what Hollow's End believed. And slowly, swing by swing, Maren Holloway was learning to stop caring too. She did not know it yet, but that hill and that half-blind old dog and the foolish thing she was doing in the dark were about to outlast every proud house in the valley. Every morning began the same way. Darkness, cold, the shovel waiting by the door where she had left it. Maren Holloway would rise before the light. She would pull on the coat that still smelled faintly of the man who used to wear it. She would lace her boots by feel in the dark, because lighting a lamp felt like a waste of something she might need later. Then she would climb the hill. By the time the sun came gray over the eastern ridge, she was already swinging. The dog came with her every day. Ember would settle near the opening of the hollow she was carving, curl himself against the cold, and watch. Sometimes he lifted his head at a sound out on the open country. Most of the time, he just watched her, as if he understood, as if he too was waiting to see whether the old woman could do the impossible thing she had set herself to do. The upper layer of the hill fought her hardest. The frozen ground rang under the shovel blade like weak stone. Every strike sent a shock up through her wrists, into her elbows, into shoulders that had not done this kind of work in years. There were mornings she could barely close her hands around the handle. She closed them anyway, but a few feet down, the ground began to change. The soil grew softer, drier, easier to move and slower to crumble. It was almost as if winter ruled the surface of the world with an iron hand, but could not reach all the way down into the dark. So she dug toward the dark, hour after hour, day after day. The work stripped her down to nothing but the next swing, and the one after that. Her palms split open along the old calluses. Blood dried dark into the grain of the wooden handle, and she gripped it anyway. The skin hardened. Then the hard skin cracked too. Some evenings the ache in her shoulders ran so deep, she wrapped a length of rope around each wrist just to keep her grip from giving out before the light did. And still, the hollow grew. Slow, stubborn, relentless. The same way she had become. By the end of the first week, it was deep enough to block the worst of the wind. By the end of the second, it had become a real chamber, carved back into the heart of the hill, maybe 11 feet across, maybe 15 feet deep. She did not measure it with anything but her own 2 eyes and the length of her own tired body. But she made one choice that would have surprised the proud builders down in town. She kept the ceiling low, not because she had to, because she wanted to. She had spent a lifetime in rooms with high, handsome ceilings, rooms her husband had loved, rooms that looked like something. And she had learned, that last terrible winter, that all that lovely open air above your head was simply more cold to fight and more warmth to lose. She remembered the old root cellars from her girlhood, the freight sheds, the way the heat in those low, mean little places seemed to hang close to you, like a hand on your shoulder. High ceilings impress the people who come to visit, she thought. Low ceilings keep you alive. So she carved her ceiling low, curving instead of rising, and she did not care one bit how it looked. In the long evenings, when her arms were too spent to swing anymore, she would sit at the mouth of the hollow with Ember's gray head resting on her knee, and the memories would come. They always came at that hour, in the soft place between work and sleep, when she was too tired to keep the door shut against them. She remembered her husband's hands, how careful they had been, how he used to fit a board into place and run his thumb along the seam again and again until it satisfied him. He had built their house with those hands. He had been so sure of it. "Nothing gets through these walls, Maren," he'd say, knocking his knuckles against the timber. Nothing. And she had loved him for that certainty, for the way he believed a man could build a wall strong enough to keep the world out. She did not blame him. She wanted to be clear about that, even with no one to say it to. She did not blame him for the cold that found its way in anyway. But sitting there at the mouth of her hole in the ground, with her bleeding hands and her old dog, she understood something now that she had not understood when she still had a husband to argue with. The cold had never been kept out by how sure he was. Certainty did not stop the wind. Only the right kind of stubbornness did. The kind that listened. The kind that watched what the ground was actually doing instead of what a man wished it would do. She wiped her eyes with the back of one cracked hand, told herself it was the wind, and went back inside to sleep. Then one evening, as the sun bled out behind the western ridges, she stepped into the unfinished chamber and stopped. For the first time, the wind could not reach her. Outside, the air still tore across the open country with that same hungry sound she had come to hate. But inside the hill, there was only stillness, only earth, only silence. She stood there a long time, just listening to nothing at all. And after so many months of carrying her grief from one cold day into the next, that silence felt almost like a pair of arms around her. Word of what she was doing had spread, of course. It always did. But it was near the end of the third week before anyone climbed the hill to see it for themselves. It was Garrett Becker who came first. He came with a small wagon, and on the wagon was a stack of scrap lumber. Not enough to build a proper house. Just enough in his mind to throw together some kind of shack, something that would keep a foolish old woman up off the cold ground until she came to her senses. He pulled the wagon up near the entrance and stood looking at the chamber she had carved into the hill. For a moment he said nothing, then he shook his head. "You're making a mistake, Maren." She rested both hands on the shovel handle. She did not answer. He pointed up at the curved ceiling. Earth like that. It collapses. One bad season, and it comes down on whoever's underneath it. She still said nothing. He pointed toward the damp soil near the mouth of the cave. "And moisture. Moisture gets into everything down here. Into your blankets. Into your lungs. You'll be sick by midwinter." Then he turned and pointed out toward the open country where the first real clouds of the season were stacking up beyond the horizon, dark and heavy. "And when the snow piles up out there," he said, "that whole roof of yours is going to be carrying the weight of it. You understand that? You're sleeping under all that weight." And here was the thing that made Garrett Becker dangerous in a way that Thaddeus Crane and his loud laughter never were. Garrett was not laughing. He was not cruel. He was not proud, not the way the rich man was. He was a craftsman, a good one, and every word he said came from a lifetime of building things that kept people safe. His concerns were real. That was exactly what made them so hard to stand against. For a long moment, Maren Holloway simply listened to him. She let him finish. And then, instead of arguing, she looked at something small. A thin draft of cold air was sliding in through the front of his heavy coat. She could see the fabric shiver, just slightly, every time the wind gusted across the hill. A tiny gap near the top button. Nothing a man like Garrett would ever notice on himself. She nodded toward it. "Do you sleep well in that?" she asked. He frowned. "In what?" "The wind," she said. "The little bit of it that gets in. The part you can't see." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The breeze kept working its way through that small opening in his coat. Almost invisible, and yet impossible to stop once it had found its way inside. Garrett Becker looked down at his own chest. Then he looked away. He left the lumber where he had dropped it, climbed back onto his wagon, and rode down toward town without another word. He still believed the hill would fail her. He was certain of it. But as he crossed the cold, open ground toward home, the builder found himself thinking about something he had never once stopped to consider in all his years of fitting boards and hanging doors. It was not the cold he had ever truly fought. Wood could stop the cold. Sometimes it was the moving air, the wind that found the seam, the gap, the place where two good boards almost met but didn't. Stopping the cold was one battle. Stopping the wind, that was something else entirely. And for the first time in his life, Garrett Becker was not sure he knew how to win it. The first real trouble came not with snow. It came with rain. A slow, cold rain that settled over the valley and would not move on. For the better part of 2 days, the sky hung low and gray, and the water came down soft and steady and endless. At first, Maren thought little of it. Rain was rain. Then, one evening, a single drop of water struck the back of her hand. She looked up. Along parts of the curved ceiling, tiny beads of moisture had begun to gather, just a shimmer at first. But by the next morning, the sleeping corner of the chamber felt damp to the touch, and the air carried a heavier smell. Wet earth, stale earth. Something had changed, and it had changed for the worse. She stood in the middle of the chamber she had bled to build, and she felt the old fear rise up in her throat, because she knew that smell, not from here, from before. She remembered the way the air in the house had felt near the end, heavy, close. The way a damp chill could settle into a man's chest and never quite leave. She remembered her husband coughing in the dark, and the way she had told herself it was nothing. Just a chill. Just the weather. It had not been nothing. For one long, terrible moment, standing in her damp little chamber, Maren Holloway wondered if Garrett Becker had been right after all. Then she made herself stop. She made herself breathe. She was not going to lose this place the way she had lost the last one. She was not going to stand by, telling herself it was nothing, while the damp crept in and took everything. This time, she was going to fight. That night, it was the dog who showed her where to begin. For weeks, Ember had slept against the rear wall of the chamber, in the deepest part, where the temperature stayed the most even. But that night, he would not settle there. He rose, he circled, and then, without any fuss at all, he carried himself toward the mouth of the cave and curled up near the doorway instead. Maren watched him do it. She had learned, over a long life, to trust what an animal did with his body more than what a man did with his mouth. Ember did not change his habits without a reason. He never had. So in the morning, instead of arguing with the problem, she studied it. She followed the watermarks across the ceiling with her eyes. She watched where the beads gathered and where they ran. She knelt in the cold mud outside and looked at the slope of the hill above the chamber, the way the rain moved across it, the places where it pooled and the places where it didn't. She spent the better part of a day just looking, and by the afternoon, she understood. The rainwater was gathering near the entrance, where the slope funneled it, and then slowly working its way through the surrounding soil, finding the low places, finding her. The dog had not moved away from the rear wall out of foolishness. He had moved toward the only part of the chamber the water had not yet reached, so she went back to work. She dug a trench around the mouth of the cave, a shallow channel to catch the water before it could gather. Then she dug another, leading away downhill, to carry it off and away from the chamber entirely. She gave the water somewhere else to go. Then came the harder part. She walked out to a rocky ridge nearby and gathered stones. Dark, dense, heavy stones, the kind that held their shape and did not crumble. She hauled them back to the hill one armful at a time, her shoulders screaming, her hands wrapped in rope, and she built herself a raised platform above the damp ground, a bed of stone, so that even if the floor turned to mud beneath her, she would sleep dry, lifted up above the wet. The work cost her 3 more brutal days. But when it was done, the change was immediate. The floor stayed dry. The heavy smell lifted from the air. The chamber felt clean again, and solid, and hers. That evening, she rested one cracked hand on the cold stone of her new platform. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. The cave had not failed her. It had simply been asking her a question, the way the land always did. And like everything the earth ever offered, the answer had to be earned with her own 2 hands before she was allowed to understand it. She thought of her husband then, of how he would have hated this place. A hole in the ground. No square walls. No proud roof. Nothing to be sure of. And she thought, gently, without bitterness, that maybe being a little less sure was exactly what had been missing. All those years ago, she lay down on her bed of dry stone that night, with the dog curled at her feet, and she slept without coughing. It was the first night in a very long time that the dark felt like a friend. She woke once, deep in that night, the way old women do. And for a moment, in the warm and the quiet, she forgot. She reached out across the bed of stone for the shape that should have been there, the warm weight of him, the slow sound of his breathing. For just one heartbeat, before her hand found only cold rock and old fur, she was a young wife again, in a bed in a house that still had a man in it. Then she remembered. She lay there in the dark and let the missing of him wash over her, the way it still did sometimes, without warning, all these months later. She thought of the small things, the way he had hummed, low and tuneless, when he worked, the way he salted his food before he ever tasted it, every single time, and how it used to drive her to distraction, and how she would have given anything now to be driven to distraction by it just once more. She thought of the night the first boards went up on their first wall, how he had stood back and looked at it, hands on his hips, proud as a man could be. How he had pulled her in close against his side and said, "There, now nothing can touch us, Maren. Nothing in this whole world." He had been wrong. but he had not been foolish to believe it. That was the thing she had come to understand, down here in the patient dark. He had only wanted to keep her safe. Every nail he drove had been a kind of promise. I will not let the world hurt you. It was not a small thing to be loved like that. It simply had not been enough. Love rarely was, against a winter that did not care how much you loved. She wiped her face in the dark, and this time she did not tell herself it was the wind. There was no one left to pretend for. There was only her, and the dog, and the warm stones, and the memory of a good man who had done his best and lost anyway. I'm still here, she whispered into the dark. To him, maybe. To herself. I'm still here, and I'm learning. I wish you could have seen it. The dog sighed in his sleep and pressed closer against her side. And after a while, the missing of him softened into something she could carry, the way it always did, and she slept again. She would carry him up the hill with her in the morning, the way she carried him everywhere now, not as a weight, as a reason. Every wall she sealed, every drop of water she turned away, every small degree of warmth she coaxed out of the cold, dark earth, was a thing she was learning that he had needed her to know, and that she had learned too late to save him. She could not give any of it back to him now, but she was beginning to understand something, slowly, the way she understood everything in this place, that there might be others, somewhere, someday, others the cold had not yet taken, and if she could not save the one she had lost, perhaps she had been left here to save someone she had not yet met. She did not know, that quiet night, how soon that thought would be put to the test. The weather did not stay soft for long. The rain moved off, and behind it came a deeper cold. Not yet the killing kind, but a sharpening of the air, a warning for anyone who knew how to read one. And so Maren turned her mind from staying dry to staying warm, because she understood now that shelter alone would not be enough. A hole in the ground could block the wind and shed the rain. But the night she had buried her husband had taught her the cruelest lesson of all. It was not enough to make heat. A fire makes heat. Their stove had made plenty of heat that last winter. It was holding the heat after the fire died down that had beaten them. That was the harder problem, and she knew it. So she went looking. She spent the better part of an afternoon picking through a rusted-out scrap heap beyond the old freight road, where folks had been throwing their broken things for longer than anyone could say. Most of it was useless. Bent wheel rims, split barrels, the twisted skeletons of stoves that had given up the ghost. But then she found what she needed. A cracked iron kettle, a length of stovepipe, dented but whole, and enough odd scrap metal to cobble together something that might, with patience, become a small stove. She carried it all back to the hill, and then she did the thing that none of the proud men down in town would have thought to do. She dug a shallow pit right beneath where her little stove would sit, and into that pit she packed the dark, dense stones, mixed in with dry gravel. She had no fine word for what she was doing. She did not know the language a learned man might have used for it. She only knew what a long life had taught her. Some things give up their heat fast, and then they're done. Other things drink the heat in slow, and hold on to it long after the fire has gone cold. She trusted the second kind. She had always, in her own way, been the second kind. Then she made another choice. She lowered the floor near the entrance, just a few inches, but it mattered. Cold air, she had noticed, was a heavy thing. It sank. It pooled in the low places, the way the rainwater had. So she gave the cold air a low place to gather, a place down near the door, far from where she would lay her head. And across the doorway itself, she hung 2 heavy horse blankets she had salvaged from an old freight camp. One blanket stops the wind. She had learned that much. But 2 blankets trapped the warmth between them like a held breath. Ember, for his part, took one look at the bed of stones above the buried pit and claimed it as his own. He turned 3 slow circles and lay down on the warm rock with a sigh that sounded almost human. Maren let him have it. That night, she lit a small fire in her cobbled-together stove, and she waited. Hours passed. The flames burned low, then lower, then died altogether. The chamber went dark and still, and she reached out in that darkness and laid her bare hand on the stones beneath her. They were warm, not hot, not glowing, just quietly, faithfully warm, holding on to everything the little fire had left behind, long after the fire itself was gone. Maren Holloway sat very still in the dark, and she felt something rise up in her chest that she had not let herself feel in a very long time. It was not joy. It was too quiet for joy. It was something rarer than that. It was the feeling that the worst thing had already happened to her, and that she had survived it. And that maybe, just maybe, she might be able to build a life on the other side of it after all. It was possibility. She had nearly forgotten the shape of it. A few days after that, she had visitors again. This time it was Verena Stowe, the minister's wife, one of the most respected women in all of Hollow's End, and she knew it. She came up the hill with 2 other women from the church, walking a careful step behind her, the way they always did. They carried a loaf of bread, an old wool blanket, and expressions that mixed a thin, churchly concern with something far closer to disapproval. Verena Stowe stood at the mouth of the chamber and looked down at the low entrance for a long moment. "No woman keeps her dignity," she said at last, "living down in the dirt like this." The other women murmured their agreement behind her. "We weren't made to burrow, Maren, like animals. It isn't decent. It isn't Christian." Maren looked at her. Then she stepped to one side and gestured toward the dark, low doorway behind her. "Come in and see it then," she said. "Come and feel it for yourself." None of them moved. The dark mouth of the cave, the strange warmth breathing out of it, and the old dog lying in the entrance, his one good eye fixed on them, unblinking. It made them hesitate. It made them afraid, though none of them would ever have called it that. Verena Stowe lifted her chin. "No," she said, "that won't be necessary." A few minutes later, the 3 women turned and walked back down the hill toward town, their good deed done, their bread left in the cold by the entrance. Maren watched them go until they disappeared across the open ground. Then she reached up and lowered the horse blankets over the doorway, sealing the evening wind outside once more. She did not feel angry. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She did not even feel hurt anymore, because she had stopped somewhere along the way, needing the town to understand her. Their laughter, their pity, their thin disapproval, none of it could reach her down here, any more than the wind could. There was only one judge whose opinion still mattered to her now. And that judge was already on its way. She could feel it in the air, in the sharpening cold, in the low, dark line of cloud building beyond the hills. The town could laugh all it liked. Winter would have the final word. It was the dampness, in the end, that broke the wall between Maren and the one person who would finally believe her. It happened on a hard gray afternoon, when the cold had a real edge to it for the first time. Maren was outside, packing the last of the drainage trench, when she heard someone coming up the hill. Slow, unsteady, and every few steps, a sound she knew far too well. A cough, deep and rattling and wet. She straightened up and turned, and there was Delphine Becker, Garrett's wife, a small, neat woman who had always kept to herself, climbing the hill alone with one hand pressed to her chest. She stopped a little ways off, breathing hard, and the two women looked at each other across the cold ground. "My husband doesn't know I'm here," Delphine said. Then the cough took her again, and she had to wait it out, bent forward, before she could go on. "He built our house with his own hands," she said when she could speak. "He's so proud of it. And it's a good house, Maren. Everyone says so." She gave a small, broken laugh that turned into another cough. "But there's a draft along the north wall that he swears isn't there. And every night I lie in that good house, in that fine bed, and I can't get warm, and I can't stop coughing." She lifted her eyes. "He says a hole in the ground can't hold heat. He says it's foolishness. But I heard what you said to him about the wind." She wrapped her arms around herself. "And I needed to feel it. Just once. I needed to know if it was true." Maren did not say a word. She simply stepped aside, lifted the edge of the horse blankets, and held the doorway open. Delphine Becker hesitated only a moment. Then she ducked her head and stepped down into the dark. And almost the instant she crossed the threshold, she stopped. The wind was gone, not blocked, not muffled. Simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. In its place was a warmth that did not roar and did not rush. A warmth that wrapped around her shivering body, slow and even and complete, the way warmth had not touched her in weeks. She stood there in the soft dark, and her breath came easier. She took one careful breath, then another, and the terrible rattle in her chest began, for the first time in days, to ease. Maren guided her to the bed of stones beside the dead fire. Delphine lowered herself onto it, and her hand drifted down to the rock, and her eyes went wide. The fire had been out for hours. The stones were still warm. Ember rose from his place by the door, crossed the chamber, and rested his gray head gently against Delphine's knee. She let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and she laid her trembling hand on the old dog's head. She looked around her, slowly, at the plastered earth walls, at the heavy blankets across the door, at the warm stones beneath her. "This place," she said, and her voice cracked on it, "it doesn't fight the winter." She looked up at Maren, and her eyes were shining. "It just refuses to let it in." Maren said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. Garrett Becker might have been the finest builder in the whole valley. He might have known more about timber and joinery than any man for 100 miles. But sitting there in that warm dark, with her cough finally quiet in her chest, Delphine Becker knew, all the way down to her bones, that her husband had been wrong. And the widow on the hill, the foolish old woman they had all laughed at, had been right all along. For the first time in more nights than she could count, Delphine Becker closed her eyes, leaned back against the warm earthen wall, and rested. Outside, the wind picked up, prowling around the hill, searching for a way in. It did not find one. And far beyond the dark line of the hills, where no one in Hollow's End was yet looking, the real winter was finally beginning to wake. The cold came down in earnest after that. Not the killing cold, not yet, but the kind that put an edge on every breath. The kind that made the dogs in town restless and the old folks quiet. And Maren Holloway, who had become something of a student of the cold, felt it change. She turned all her attention now to one thing: fuel, because she understood, the way only someone who has lost everything to the cold can understand, that a clever shelter was worth nothing at all if there was nothing to burn inside it. So every spare hour became preparation. She gathered dried cow chips from the open country and stacked them beneath a scrap of tarp. She dug sage root from the frozen ground with her bare, cracked hands. She cut low willow branches wherever the creek beds offered them and dragged them back to the hill in bundles. The pile she built was not much to look at. It was small. It was humble. It was the kind of thing a proud man would have laughed at. That was exactly why she trusted it. Winter, she had learned, did not care in the slightest how impressive a thing looked. It was during those days of gathering that she met old Asa Pruitt on the open ground. He was a retired trapper, a lean and weathered old man who had spent most of his life reading the land the way other folks read a page. He noticed things other people walked right past. He stopped when he saw her dragging her bundle of willow. For a moment he just looked at her, at the worn coat, the wrapped hands, the gray dog at her heel. "You're the one digging into the hill," he said. It was not a question. "I am." He nodded slowly. Then he turned his face toward the far hills, and his eyes narrowed at something only he seemed able to see. "The crows are flying low," he said, "lower than they ought to. And the rabbits left the open burrows weeks back." He worked his jaw. "Ice on the water troughs before the sun's even down." He looked back at her. "Something's coming," he said. "Something this valley hasn't felt in a long, long while. Most folks won't believe it till it's on top of them." Most folks, when old Asa Pruitt said such things, shrugged and went back to their business. Maren Holloway did not. She thanked him, and she went back up the hill, and she gathered twice as much fuel as she had planned. The trouble she had not planned for came on a windy night not long after. She had lit her small fire and was sitting beside it, mending the wrapping on her hands, when she noticed the smoke begin to behave strangely. Most of it rose clean up through the pipe, the way it always had. Most of it. But every so often, when the wind outside shifted and pressed against the hill from a new direction, the smoke seemed to hesitate. It paused at the mouth of the pipe, as if uncertain. And then a thin gray curl of it bent back down into the chamber. Not much, just a little. But Maren sat very still and watched it, and a cold feeling that had nothing to do with the weather settled into her stomach, because she had learned by now that small things were the dangerous ones. A draft too thin to see, a drop of water on the back of a hand, a little gray curl of smoke that should have gone up and didn't. Small things were what killed you in the winter. The big things, you saw coming. She sat awake long past the time she should have slept, listening to the wind prowl around the hill and watching the smoke fight its quiet, uncertain battle at the mouth of the pipe. The shelter was better than it had been a month ago. Far better. But it was not ready. Not yet. And somewhere out beyond the dark, the thing old Asa Pruitt had warned her about was drawing closer. Then, one night, the small problem became a deadly one. It happened fast, the way these things do. A hard gust struck the hill from the wrong direction, all at once, and the draft in the pipe reversed completely. The smoke that should have risen rolled backward instead, spilling down and out and spreading across the low ceiling of the chamber in a thickening gray cloud. Maren was half asleep when it happened. It was the dog who woke her. Ember scrambled up onto his feet, shaking his gray head, his breath coming in sharp, choking gasps. He was an old dog. His lungs were not what they had been, and the smoke had found him low, near the floor, where he slept. Maren came awake to the sound of him fighting for air. She did not stop to think. She was on her feet in an instant, the smoke stinging her own eyes and burning in her throat. She grabbed Ember by the collar and hauled him up, and she dragged the both of them toward the doorway, throwing the horse blankets aside, out into the bitter, freezing dark. They half fell into the snow outside. The cold hit them like a wall, but the air was clean. Maren knelt there in the snow, gasping, one arm wrapped around the dog, feeling his ribs heave against her side as he coughed, and finally, slowly, began to breathe again. She held him until he was still. And then, kneeling there in the freezing dark with her old dog in her arms, Maren Holloway felt something break loose inside her chest. Because for one terrible moment, in the smoke and the dark, she had thought she was going to lose him. And he was all she had left. She thought of another night, then. Another time she had knelt in the dark, helpless, while someone she loved fought for breath that would not come. She had not been able to fix it that other time. She had sat by the stove and watched her husband's chest rise and fall, slower and slower, and there had been nothing in all her stubbornness or all her love that could change it. She buried her face in the dog's fur and let the tears come, hot in the freezing air. And then she wiped them away, because this time was different. This time, she could fix it. She just had to understand what the smoke was doing. So she did not go back to sleep. She sat outside in the cold, wrapped in a blanket with Ember pressed warm against her side, and she watched. Not the fire, not the stove, the smoke. She had banked the fire low, so a thin thread of it still rose from the pipe, and she sat there in the dark for hours, watching that thread bend and twist and dance in the shifting wind. She watched the way it rose clean when the wind came from one direction. She watched the way it faltered and dipped when the wind swung around and struck the hill from another. She watched until the first gray light came up over the eastern hills, and by the time the sun rose, she understood. The wind, when it came across the hill from a certain side, was rolling up and over the top of the slope and then curling back down on itself right over the mouth of the pipe, pressing the smoke back down into the chamber instead of letting it climb free. The wind was not getting into her shelter, but it was reaching down the chimney with one cold finger and pushing her own smoke back at her. It was a different battle than any she had fought yet, but it was the same enemy. It had always been the same enemy. The wind, looking for a way in, finding the one weakness she had not yet sealed. That morning, she walked back out to the scrap heap. She dug through the rusted ruin of it until she found a curved section of metal, bent at an angle, the leftover elbow of some long-dead contraption. She carried it back and fitted it onto the top of her stovepipe, changing the angle of the opening, turning its mouth away from the side the wind came hardest from. Then she gathered stones again, and a short distance from the pipe, on the side where the wind struck hardest, she built a low wall of stone, not high, just high enough to break the strongest of the gusts before they could reach the chimney and do their mischief. That evening, with her heart in her throat, she tested it. She lit the fire. She waited for the wind to shift. It came, hard from the bad side, and she held her breath, and the smoke rose clean. It climbed past the little curved elbow, past the low stone wall, up and out into the cold sky, and it kept on climbing, steady, unbroken, the way it was supposed to. The draft held. Maren let out a long, shaking breath. That night, Ember slept on his bed of warm stones, deep and easy, and he did not cough. Not once. Maren rested her hand on his neck in the dark and felt the slow, even rise and fall of his breathing. "There," she whispered to him. "There now." The wind, she understood now, would never stop looking for a way inside. It would test every seam, every angle, every opening she gave it, and some she didn't even know she had. That was simply what the wind did, and a person survived by finding the way in first. It was not long after that she had her smallest, and perhaps her most unexpected visitor, a boy. He could not have been more than 10 or 11. A nephew of the Beckers, sent up the hill on some flimsy errand about a lost goat that everyone knew had been found hours before. But the goat was just an excuse. It was curiosity that had pushed him up the slope, the kind of fierce, fearless curiosity that only children seem to keep. He stood at the low entrance, peering into the dark, while Ember watched him with mild interest. Maren considered him for a moment. Then she stepped aside. "Well," she said, "you came all this way. You may as well come and see." The boy ducked through the doorway. In the moment he was inside, he stopped cold. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes wide. No wind, no drafts, just an even, settled, gentle warmth that wrapped all the way around him. He knelt down by the dog and pressed his small hand against the bed of stones where Ember lay. The fire was out, stone-cold ashes in the little stove, and yet the rock beneath his hand was warm. "How?" the boy asked, looking up at her. "There's no fire. How is it warm?" Maren looked at the cold gray ashes for a moment. "Anybody can make heat, child," she said softly. "Making it, that's the easy part. Keeping it." She tapped the stone with one finger. "That's the part that takes some learning." The boy sat in the quiet, warm dark for a long time, his hand on the dog's side, and then he said something that stayed with her for a long while after he had gone. "It feels," he said, almost in a whisper, "like summer never went away, like it just came down here to hide." Maren smiled at that. Out of the mouths of children, down here, in the heart of the hill, the last warm breath of summer had been gathered up and kept, carefully against the cold. But up above, out across the open country, summer was long gone, and the thing old Asa Pruitt had warned about was almost upon them. Now, while the widow worked her quiet miracles on the hill, it would be wrong to think the proud man down in town had forgotten her entirely. Thaddeus Crane had not forgotten. He was the richest man in the valley, and he had laughed the loudest of anyone the day the foolish old widow had come down for her shovel. His laughter had filled the warehouse. It had set the other men laughing too. But laughter is a strange thing. The kind that comes easy, from a man who is truly at ease, fades quick, and leaves no mark. The kind that comes too loud, too fast, from a man who needs the whole room to hear it. That kind has roots. That kind is hiding something. And on the cold nights, alone in the grandest house in the valley, Thaddeus Crane found that he could not stop thinking about that hill. He would stand at his window, a glass of something warm in his hand, and look out across the dark toward the low rise where the thin ribbon of smoke rose, steady and patient, from the snow, and something in his chest would twist. Because the truth was a thing Thaddeus Crane had spent a great many years and a great deal of money trying very hard not to look at. The truth was that there had been another winter, long ago, before he was rich, before the big house and the loud laugh. There had been someone he loved then, and there had been a night, a cold and terrible night, when that person had needed shelter and warmth and help. And Thaddeus Crane, who had been poor then and proud even then, had told himself it was not so bad, that the cold was nothing, that a strong house and a stubborn heart were enough to outlast anything. He had been wrong. By morning, the cold had taken what he loved, and it had left him with nothing but the knowledge, locked away deep where he never had to look at it, that he could have done something, and that he had chosen, instead, to be sure. He had spent the rest of his life building walls against that memory. Big walls, grand walls, the biggest house in the whole valley, with the most expensive stove and the deepest stores of wood, so that he would never, ever again have to feel that helpless, so that he could tell himself every winter that he had finally built something strong enough. And then a foolish old widow had walked into his warehouse with a shovel and an old dog, and she had looked at the land the way he had refused to look at it. And she had started building the one thing he had spent his whole life proving he was too proud to need, a shelter that listened to the cold instead of fighting it. That was why he had laughed the loudest, not because she was foolish, because she frightened him, because some part of Thaddeus Crane, the part he had buried deepest, knew that the old woman on the hill understood something true, something he had learned once in the worst way a person can learn it, and then spent his whole life pretending he had never learned at all. He turned away from the window. He told himself, as he always did, that his house was strong, that his wood was deep, that he was safe, and far out past the hills, the dark began to gather. It came on a morning that was almost too beautiful to trust. The sky over the valley turned a strange, pale color, a sickly kind of gold, like old brass. The wind, which had not stopped prowling for days, suddenly stopped, completely. The shutters that had rattled for a week went still. The grass on the open ground did not stir. A great and heavy silence settled over Hollow's End, and somehow that silence was worse than any noise could have been. Old Asa Pruitt was already out, moving from shutter to shutter on his own small place, fastening every one of them down tight. A neighbor called out to him, asked him what on earth he was bracing for, on a still day like this. Asa did not even smile. He looked toward the far hills, where the gold of the sky was darkening to something the color of a bruise. "This cold," he said quietly, "is going to bite clean through to the bone." Up on the hill, Ember would not settle. The old dog paced, from the doorway to the rear wall and back again, from the rear wall to the doorway. Every few steps he stopped and lifted his graying head and listened to something that no human ear could catch. Maren watched him and did not interrupt. She had learned, long ago, to trust what the animal knew before she trusted what she could see for herself. By midday, even the birds had gone silent. The sky darkened another shade, and still there was no wind, and still there was no snow. Only that terrible, waiting stillness. Then the first gust came. It came out of nowhere, hard enough to fling a sheet of loose snow off the hilltop and send it stinging across the open ground. And behind it came another, and another. And within the space of an hour, the whole world beyond the hill simply vanished. The snow did not fall. It flew, sideways, fast, vicious, driven across the land like white sand flung from a giant's hand. The far hills disappeared first, then the open country, then the town itself, swallowed up behind moving curtains of white until there was nothing left to see at all. The storm had come, and down in Hollow's End, the proud houses began, one by one, to learn what the widow on the hill had learned long ago. It did not come for them gently. In the grandest house in the valley, Thaddeus Crane stood before a fire that roared like a furnace, and could not, for the life of him, get warm. He had built that fire huge. He had thrown wood on it until the flames climbed and snapped, and the heat poured out into the room. And the cold drank it all down and asked for more. He pressed his hand to the inside of his fine timber wall, and he felt the chill come straight through it into his palm. He looked closer. There was ice forming there, on the inside of the wall, in his own grand house, in his own bedroom. And for the first time in many, many years, Thaddeus Crane felt the old helplessness come rising up out of the deep place where he had buried it. The walls, he understood, were leaking heat like a bucket full of holes. All his money, all his wood, all his pride. And the cold was walking straight through it as if it were not there at all. At the Becker place, it was no better. Garrett Becker, the finest builder in the valley, the man who had warned the widow that her hole in the ground would surely fail her, knelt by his own dying stove and stared at the wall, the most carefully fitted wall he had ever built, joints so tight you could not slide a knife blade between the boards. And there, creeping across the inside of it, was a thin, glittering skin of ice. Inside, not outside. Inside the home he had built with his own two proud hands. Beside him, Delphine had stopped coughing. That was the thing that truly frightened him. She had stopped coughing, and now she only lay there, shivering under every blanket they owned, her lips going a color he did not like. And Garrett Becker, who knew everything there was to know about wood, remembered a quiet old woman pointing at a draft in his coat and asking him a question he had not been able to answer. "Do you sleep well in that?" He had not understood then. He understood now. And at the minister's house, things were worse still. The north wind had found the chimney and was pushing down it, forcing the gray smoke back into the room, where it gathered along the ceiling and stung the eyes of the children huddled below. Verena Stowe, who had stood on the hill not long ago and spoken of dignity and decency, held her youngest daughter close against the failing stove. It was not enough. The drafts cut through everything, through the blankets, through the walls, through every prayer. And when she pulled back the edge of the blanket to check the child's small feet, her heart simply stopped. The tips of the little girl's toes had gone a pale, terrible blue. The cold had crossed the threshold of the minister's house. It was inside now, with her children. Meanwhile, up on the hill, beneath the snow, behind a low wooden door and 2 heavy blankets, there was no roaring fire, and no panic, and no terror. There was only stillness. The chamber held its warmth, even and steady, as the storm screamed itself hoarse above. The bed of dark stones gave back the heat the small fire had fed it, slow and faithful, through all the long hours. Maren Holloway fed her little stove twice that night. No more than that. Ember slept deep and easy on his warm stones, his old ribs rising and falling in peace. And in the quiet dark, with the worst storm in living memory tearing at the world above her, the widow on the hill laid her hand on the warm stone beside her, and found that she was not afraid. She thought of her husband. She thought of that other winter, in that other house, where the fire had burned all night long, and the cold had won anyway, where a hand she loved had gone cold beside a stove that never stopped burning. She thought of how sure he had been, how sure they had all been. And she understood, at last, with the storm howling its fury against the patient earth above her head, that she had finally built the thing her husband never could. Not a stronger wall, a place the winter could not get into at all. She did not yet know what the night would ask of her. She did not know that very soon the proud and the frightened of Hollow's End would come climbing through the storm toward the one light left in all that dark, toward the hill they had laughed at, toward the door of the woman they had thrown away. But she would learn it soon enough. For now there was only the storm, and the stillness, and the slow, faithful warmth of the stones, and an old dog breathing easy in the dark, while above them the whole proud world came apart at the seams. By the third night, the line of what a person can endure simply snapped. The storm had not let up. If anything, it had grown crueler. It hammered at the proud houses of Hollow's End hour after hour, and one by one, those houses gave up the things they had promised to give: warmth, safety, the simple comfort of a roof. The cold took it all. In the home he had built with his own hands, Garrett Becker knelt beside his wife and rubbed her icy fingers between his palms over and over, trying to put the life back into them. The stove had gone cold. The last of the dry wood was ash. He had stuffed rags into every seam he could find. He had hung blankets over the windows. He had done everything a master builder knew how to do, and it had not been enough. Delphine lay still beneath the blankets, her breath shallow, her lips that color he could not stand to look at. The same woman who had come down off the hill not long ago, her cough gone quiet, her eyes shining, trying to tell him something he had been too proud to hear. It just refuses to let the winter in. He had told her it was foolishness. He had told her a hole in the ground could not hold heat. Garrett Becker bowed his head over his wife's frozen hands, and he choked out the words he had spent his whole stubborn life resisting. "She was right," he whispered. "God help me. The widow was right. and I was a fool. The admission tasted like ash in his mouth, but it was the truth, and the truth, when it finally comes, does not care how much it costs. Across town, in the grandest house in the valley, Thaddeus Crane stood alone in the dark. The great fireplace that had roared like a furnace 3 nights ago was cold now, dead. He had burned through wood that should have lasted half the winter, and the cold had swallowed every bit of it and come back hungry for more. He held the last piece of firewood in his hands, the very last one. He turned it over and over, feeling the weight of it, and he understood, finally and completely, that his mansion was not a fortress. It had never been a fortress. It was an expensive wooden box, and it was slowly, patiently, turning into a tomb. All his pride, all his money, all those grand walls he had built against an old memory and an older fear. And the cold had walked through every one of them as though they were nothing at all. He thought of the hill. He thought of the thin ribbon of smoke rising steady and patient from the snow, night after night, while his own great chimney choked and failed. And he thought, for the first time in a great many years, about that other winter, the one he had spent his whole life refusing to remember, the someone he had lost, because he had been too proud to believe that the cold could beat him. He had sworn that long ago morning that he would never feel so helpless again. And here he was, helpless, in the finest house in the valley, with the last stick of firewood in his hands. The pride was gone now. There was nothing left of it. The money was useless. The grand walls were useless. The prayers, the certainty, the long, loud laughter, all of it useless as the snow piling against his door. And in the deepest, darkest hour of that night, the proud man's mind turned, against all his will, toward the one place in the whole valley where a light still burned. The hill he had mocked. The widow he had thrown away. He was not the only one whose thoughts went there. All across Hollow's End, in failing house after failing house, the same picture rose up in the same desperate minds. A thin ribbon of smoke, peaceful, steady, unbroken, the woman with a shovel and an old dog. And they all understood, every one of them, the same terrible thing at the same terrible moment. If they wanted their families to live to see the morning, there was only one door left in all the world that might open for them. The storm gave them a chance. Just one. Near the middle of that third night, it eased, not for long, an hour, perhaps 2. The screaming wind dropped to a low moan, and the curtains of snow thinned just enough that, for the first time in 3 days, shapes could be made out in the dark. It was not mercy. The storm was only catching its breath, but it was enough. And the proud people of Hollow's End knew it might be the only chance they would get. 3 small groups left their dying homes that night and turned their faces toward the hill. Thaddeus Crane went first, though he had the farthest to go. He carried his young grandson bundled against his chest, the boy's small face buried in his coat. The richest man in the valley, struggling through snow up to his knees, carrying the only thing that money had never been able to protect. Garrett Becker came behind, half carrying Delphine, one arm wrapped around her to hold her up, the other thrown across his face against the biting wind. She could barely walk. He would not let her stop. And the minister, Eliphalet Stowe, came last of all, with his youngest daughter wrapped in every blanket the house had left, held tight against his chest, while his wife Verena clung to his arm and the older children stumbled along behind. No one spoke much. There was not the breath to spare for it. The climb took everything they had. The snow was deep and treacherous, and the cold cut through wool and leather as though they were made of paper. More than once, someone went down, and someone else hauled them back up. But above them, all the while, a thin ribbon of smoke drifted up into the breaking sky. It was the only thing they could see in all that dark, so they followed it. And at last, they reached the low door they had laughed at, the wolf's den, the animal's burrow, the foolish hole in the ground. It stood now between them and the death waiting at their backs. Ember sat just inside the doorway, his graying head lifted, his one good eye fixed on the shapes gathering out of the storm. He did not bark. He simply watched, the way he always did, as if he had been waiting for this all along. And on the other side of that low door, in the warm and the quiet, Maren Holloway heard them coming. She had known, somehow, that they would. She rose from her bed of warm stone. She did not light a lamp. She stood in the dark of the chamber she had bled to build, and she listened to the sound of footsteps and voices struggling up the hill toward her. And she did not move to open the door. Not yet. Because in that moment, she was not alone in the dark. Every cruel word came back to her. The laughter rolling across the warehouse floor. 60 years old, and she's gone and lost her mind. The builder's certainty. The minister's wife, lifting her chin. No woman keeps her dignity living in the dirt like this. Every word had survived the storm. They had laughed her out of their world. They had pitied her and dismissed her and turned their backs. And now they were standing outside her door in the dark, begging to be let into the very place they had despised. She could refuse them. The thought was right there, in the dark with her. Quiet, reasonable, almost sweet. Let them feel, just once, what it is to be turned away. She stood there with her hand near the door, and the warm air at her back, and the cold, pleading voices in front of her. And Maren Holloway felt the whole weight of every wrong they had done her come pressing down. Then a voice came through the door, strained, smaller than she had ever heard it. Thaddeus Crane. Maren. A pause. The wind. If you don't open this door, his voice cracked. The proud man's voice, cracking like ice. There's a child out here, the minister's little girl. She won't last another night. Maren, please. Please. She had never once heard that man say that word. And then, through the gap at the bottom of the door, she heard it. The thin, exhausted sound of a child too cold and too tired even to cry properly anymore. Maren closed her eyes, and in the dark behind her eyes, she did not see Thaddeus Crane, or his pride, or the warehouse, or the laughter. She saw a small hand going cold in hers, beside a stove that burned all night long in a fine, proud house that could not save it. She had not been able to open any door for her husband that other winter. There had been no warm hill to carry him to, no second chance. The cold had simply taken him and left her to live with all the things she could not undo. And now, here on the other side of her own door, was a child whose toes were going the same terrible color. A child she still had time to save. That was what decided it. Not forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness would come later, or it would not. It was the child. It was the small hand she could still hold on to. Maren Holloway reached out and pulled the low door open wide. The stormlight fell across the faces gathered there. Thaddeus Crane, his grandson, clutched to his chest. Garrett Becker, holding up his failing wife. The minister, with the bundled child in his arms, and the blue at the edges of her small lips. They looked at her. They did not say anything. There was nothing they could say. Maren stepped back to let them in. "Keep your heads low," she said. Her voice was steady. "All of you. The warm air stays lower than most folks think. Stay down close to the floor and the stones, and you'll be all right." One by one, they ducked through the low doorway and came down into the warm dark. And one by one, as the warmth of the hill closed over them, the sounds they made changed. The sharp, gasping breaths of the freezing eased into something slower, something almost like sobbing, the sound a body makes when it finally stops fighting to survive. Maren did not let them simply collapse. There was an order to it, and she knew it the way she knew everything about her hill now. "The children," she said, "closest to the stones, right here, quick now." The minister laid his little daughter down on the warm bed of dark stone, and Thaddeus set his grandson beside her, and the two small frozen bodies were placed where the gathered warmth of the earth could reach them best. "The little ones nearest," Maren said. "Then the women, the men along the outside, away from the heat. You've got the most left in you. Give the warmth to the ones who've got the least." No one argued. The richest man in the valley took his place along the cold outer edge of the chamber without a word of complaint. The master builder settled his wife close to the stones and knelt behind her, and asked for nothing for himself. They did exactly as the widow told them, because down here, in this place, she was the one who knew. And then the chamber filled with the simple, holy sound of people breathing. No apologies. There was no room yet for apologies. No talk of who had been right and who had been wrong. No victory in the widow's eyes, and no triumph in her voice. Just people, trying to stay alive. And an old woman, moving quietly among them, feeding her small fire by careful measures, doing the thing she had taught herself to do. The hours passed. The fire burned low, and Maren did not build it higher. She had learned better than that. The stones did the work the fire could not. Slow, faithful, giving back all through the night the warmth they had drunk in. And little by little, color began to return to the frozen faces in the dark. The blue faded from small fingers. The terrible shivering slowed, and then stilled. Cheeks that had gone gray and waxen warmed, by inches, back toward the living. Verena Stowe sat with her youngest daughter cradled against her, her eyes never leaving the child's face. She had not spoken since they came in. She only watched and waited and held her breath. And then the little girl stirred. Beneath the blankets, the child's small foot moved. Her toes flexed, just barely, just once. A tiny motion. The kind of thing a person might miss entirely if they were not watching for it with their whole heart. But Verena saw it. So did everyone. The whole chamber went still, watching that small foot move beneath the blanket, that tiny sign of life returning where the cold had so nearly snuffed it out. Verena Stowe lowered her head over her daughter, and she closed her eyes, and no words came out of her at all. Only tears. They ran down her face in the warm dark and dropped silent onto the child's blanket, and she did not try to stop them, and no one expected her to. The same woman who had once stood at this very door and spoken of dignity, who had refused to even step inside, who had called this place a thing fit only for animals. She wept now in the warm heart of it, over the child it had given back to her. And the widow she had pitied stood quietly nearby, and watched, and said nothing. For 4 nights and 3 days, that storm held the valley in its fist. And for 4 nights and 3 days, the inside of the hill became a whole world of its own. Outside, the wind screamed and clawed and threw itself against the patient earth. Inside, slowly, a kind of life took shape, a rhythm, the strange, close intimacy of people who have nothing left but each other and the warmth they share. Maren rose at nearly the same hour each day, by some clock inside her that the dark could not touch. She checked the stovepipe, she inspected the door, she fed the fire small, measured amounts of fuel, never wasting a scrap, never letting the chamber grow too cold or burning more than the stones required. The others watched her do it. They could not help themselves. Garrett Becker, especially. The master builder spent most of those long hours simply watching how the dark stones drank in the heat of the small fire and gave it back, slow and steady, hour after hour, long after the flames had died. But more than what happened, he watched what did not happen. The temperature never crashed. The walls never dripped. The chamber never filled with smoke or with the killing cold. The thing simply worked. And every hour that it worked was another hour that everything Garrett Becker had believed about walls and roofs and the proper way to keep a family safe quietly came apart and was replaced by something humbler and truer. Thaddeus Crane found himself staring at the small fire again and again. Such a little flame, a few cow chips, a handful of willow. Back in his great house, he would have burned 3 times as much wood for half this comfort, and counted himself wise for it. The smallness of it humbled him more than any argument ever could have. A whole life spent believing that more was the answer. More wood, more wall, more money, more. And here was an old widow keeping a dozen souls alive through the worst storm in living memory on almost nothing at all. Because she had understood the one thing he never had. It was not about how much you could burn. It was about how much you could keep. It was on the second night that he finally spoke to her. The others were sleeping or close to it. The children breathed easy on their warm stones. And Thaddeus Crane sat against the cold outer wall where the widow had put him. And he watched her bank the little fire for the night. And something in him that had been locked for 30 years came quietly open. There was someone, he said. His voice was very low. Maren did not turn from the fire, but she went still, listening. Long ago, he said, before any of this, before the house, the money, before they ever called me the richest man in the valley. He stared into the small flames. There was someone I loved, and there was a winter, and they needed help and shelter, and He stopped, The wind moaned far away above the earth. I told myself it wasn't so bad, he said. I told myself the cold was nothing a strong heart couldn't beat. I was poor then, and proud, and I was sure, so sure. His hands had begun to tremble, and he pressed them flat against his knees to still them. By morning, the cold had taken them, and it left me knowing I could have done something, and that I chose, instead, to be certain. He finally looked up at her, and his eyes in the firelight were not the eyes of a proud man at all. They were the eyes of a man who had been carrying a body up a hill for 30 years and had only just now set it down. I built everything after that to never feel it again, he said. The big house, all of it. Walls against a thing that walls can't stop. He let out a breath that shook. And then you came along, with your shovel and your dog, and you looked at the cold the way I should have looked at it, and you weren't afraid to learn from it. He shook his head slowly. I laughed at you because I couldn't stand to see you do the brave thing I'd been too proud to do my whole life. For a long moment, Maren said nothing. She finished banking the fire. She wiped her cracked hands on her coat. And then she came and lowered herself onto the warm stone, not far from him, and she looked into the same small flames he was looking into. I had a husband, she said after a while. He built us a house, a good one. He used to knock on the walls and tell me nothing could ever get through them. A faint, sad smile touched her mouth. He believed it right up until the end. He sat by a stove that burned all night, and the cold came in through the seams he couldn't see, and it took him anyway. She paused. I didn't blame him, she said. I want you to understand that. He wasn't a fool. He was just sure. The same way you were sure. The same way the whole town was sure. She turned and looked at Thaddeus Crane directly. Being sure is what kills us, out here, in the cold. It's not the wind that gets in. It's the certainty that there's no way it could. The proud man looked at the widow. Two people who had each lost someone to the cold. Two people who had spent their grief in opposite ways. One had built walls against the world. The other had learned to dig beneath it. And for the first time, across that small warm fire, they saw each other clearly, not as the foolish widow and the proud merchant, just as two people who had loved someone and lost them to the same patient enemy and survived to sit beside the same small flame. I'm sorry, Thaddeus Crane said, for all of it. Maren Holloway nodded slowly. I know, she said, and that was all. That was enough. It was not the whole of forgiveness, perhaps, but it was the first true stone of it, laid down in the warm dark, where the cold could not reach. It was not only the proud man who came to her in those long buried days. Late on the second night, when most of the chamber had gone quiet, Maren felt someone settle onto the warm stone near her. She did not have to look to know who it was. She had heard the careful, almost fearful way the woman moved, all that night and the night before, as if afraid to take up too much room in a place she had no right to be in. Verena Stowe, the minister's wife, the woman who had stood at this very door not so long ago and refused to even step inside, who had spoken of dignity and of decent women, and of animals in the dirt. For a long while, neither of them said anything at all. They simply sat, two old women side by side in the dark, watching the small fire breathe. I keep thinking about it, Verena said at last. Her voice was very small, nothing like the voice that had carried such certainty up the hill that day. What I said to you, standing right out there. She drew a shaking breath. I called this place a thing fit only for animals. I would not even come inside to look. Maren said nothing. She had learned long ago that some things a person has to say all the way to the end without being helped along. And my little girl is alive tonight, Verena went on, because of the place I was too proud to set foot in, because of the woman I was too proud to learn from. Her hand pressed flat against her own chest, as if it hurt her there. How do you forgive a thing like that? How does a person carry it? Maren was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over, slowly, and laid one cracked old hand over Verena's trembling one. You don't carry it, she said. Not the way you mean. You set it down. Verena turned to look at her. I have buried more than you know, Maren said softly, looking into the small flames. A husband, a whole life I thought I'd have. And for a long while, I carried every bit of it like a stone in my chest, and I let it make me hard. She paused. It is a heavy way to live, being hard. I think you know that better than most. A woman doesn't get as sharp as you got, Verena Stowe. Without something underneath it, she's trying not to feel. The minister's wife went very still. And then, slowly, her sharp face crumpled, the way the strongest faces do when they finally let go. Years of it. The straight back, the lifted chin, the certainty she had worn like armor her whole life. All of it came loose at once, there in the warm dark, where no one in town could see. I was so afraid, Verena whispered, of everything, of looking weak, of needing help, of being the woman who didn't know. She wept openly now, the tears running silver in the firelight. I dressed it all up as decency, as dignity, but it was only ever fear, Maren. It was fear the whole time. I know it was, Maren said gently. It always is. She did not say more than that. She did not lecture or scold or make the proud woman crawl. She only kept her old hand over Verena's and let her cry, and let the warmth of the hill do the rest. After a while, Verena's weeping eased. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the way a child does. And she looked at the old widow beside her, and something in her face had changed. Something had softened that had been hard for a very long time. My daughter is going to grow up, Verena said, knowing your name. I'll see to that. She's going to know exactly whose door it was that opened in the dark. Maren almost smiled. Just teach her to keep her own door ready, she said, for the next one who needs it. That's all the thanks I'd ever want. The two women sat together a while longer, saying nothing more, watching the fire, and the long cold thing that had stood between them all those years quietly melted away in the warmth and did not come back. By the third night, no one spoke loudly anymore. The cave seemed to discourage it. Voices dropped all on their own to something soft and close. People moved gently. Even the children, when they woke quiet, as though some part of them understood that they had been carried into a sacred kind of place. The earth swallowed the sound, the same way it swallowed the fury of the storm above. It held them all in a great patient silence, and the silence was a comfort, and they let it be. Verena Stowe slept almost not at all that first night, not out of fear, out of love. She kept reaching over, again and again, to lay her hand on her daughter's chest and feel it rise and fall. Each time, she found the child sleeping deep and warm and breathing easy. By the second night, she finally let herself sleep too. And late on the third evening, When the storm above had begun, at last, to lose its strength, Garrett Becker laid his rough builder's hand flat against the packed earth of the wall. He held it there a long time. The wall was solid, steady. It did not shiver in the wind. It did not weep with cold. It simply held, the way the whole hill held, the way the old woman who built it held. All my life, he said quietly, into the warm dark, I built houses to fight the winter. His eyes moved slowly across the sleeping faces, the children, his wife, breathing easy at last, the proud man, humbled in the corner, and then, last of all, the widow, sitting quiet beside her faithful fire, with her old gray dog asleep against her side. And you, he said, you built a place the winter can't get into. No one answered him. None was needed. The storm outside was still making its argument, growing weaker now, but stubborn to the last. And the hill had already made its own. Maren Holloway laid her hand on Ember's gray head in the dark. She looked around at all of them, at the people who had laughed at her, and pitied her, and turned her away. Sleeping now, safe and warm, in the place they had despised. Their children breathing easy on the stones she had hauled up the hill with her own bleeding hands. She had been so alone for so long, and now her hill was full of breathing, living souls, and not one of them was cold. She did not feel triumphant. She had thought, perhaps, that she might. On all those nights she lay awake listening to their distant laughter, she had imagined this moment might taste like winning. It did not. It tasted like something far better than that. It tasted like a woman who had lost everything, finding, in the warm dark of a hill nobody wanted, that she still had something left to give. And that, in the end, was the warmth that mattered most. Not the stones, not the fire. The simple, stubborn, unkillable warmth of a heart that chose, when it had every reason not to open the door. The storm did not end all at once. It did not break like a fever and leave clear sky behind. It weakened, slowly, the way a wild thing finally gives up a fight it can no longer win. The screaming dropped to a moan. The moan dropped to a whisper. And then, on the morning of the fourth day, there was only silence. A different silence than the one before the storm. This one was clean, spent. The silence of a world that had survived something. Maren Holloway was the first to lift the horse blankets and step out into it. The light hit her like cold water. After 4 days in the warm dark, the brightness of the snow was almost too much to bear. She stood at the mouth of her hill, one hand raised against the glare, and she looked out over a valley she barely recognized. The world had been made over in white. Drifts had swallowed the fences whole. The roads were simply gone, erased, as if they had never been. The open country rolled away in every direction, smooth and blinding and strange, all its familiar marks buried deep. Behind her, one by one, the others came up out of the hill. They stepped into the light, blinking and unsteady, like creatures coming out of a long sleep. The children, the minister and his wife, Garrett, with his arm still around Delphine, though she walked under her own strength now. And last of all, Thaddeus Crane, his grandson's hand swallowed up in his own. They stood together at the top of the hill, this little band of survivors, and they looked down at what the storm had left behind. Nature had finished its long, patient inspection of Hollow's End. Now came the reckoning. Thaddeus Crane reached his own grand house first, when the snow had been beaten down enough to travel. He stood at the edge of his property for a long time without going in. Part of his great barn had simply caved in beneath the weight of the wind-packed snow. The heavy support beams, the ones he had paid so dearly for, had snapped like dry kindling. One whole side of the roof sagged inward, broken, like a rib cage that had given way. The house itself still stood, but standing, he understood now, was not the same as winning. Long cracks ran across the window glass. Frost still clung to the corners of rooms that should never, in all their grandness, have been allowed to freeze. The cold had been inside his fortress. It had walked through every wall he had ever built against it. He did not weep. He had done that, in his own way, in the warm dark of the hill. He simply stood there, in the wreckage of everything he had been so sure of, and he let himself understand, all the way down, what the old widow had tried to show him. Down the valley, the minister found one whole section of his roof, bowed low under the snow it had never been built to hold. And at the Becker place, Garrett walked into his own home and stopped cold in the doorway. Ice on the inside of his wall, thick and glittering, where the warmth of his family's life should have been. Not outside, inside. For years he had trusted those walls. He had built them with all the skill a man could have, and he had been proud of them, and they had betrayed him in the 1 hour that mattered. He stood and looked at that ice for a long, long while, and then he turned around, and he walked back out into the snow, and he looked up toward the hill. The hill looked almost exactly as it always had. That was the strangest thing of all. The storm that had broken barns and bowed roofs and driven ice through the finest walls in the valley had left the hill untouched. Because the hill did not rise up to meet the storm. It did not stand proud against it, daring it to do its worst. It simply disappeared into the land. It let the snow pile over it. It let the storm pass across its back like a hand across a sleeping animal. Only the thin ribbon of smoke gave it away, drifting up clean into the cold, bright morning. The earth had not fought the storm. It had welcomed it. And in welcoming it, it had won. Ember bounded out across the fresh drifts that morning with more life in him than he had shown in weeks, leaving a trail of fresh tracks behind him, scattering snow, glad in the simple way that only an old dog freed into a clean white world can be. And against all that endless white, the small, dark shape of him stretched out from the doorway of the hill and ran joyful into the sun. It was about 2 weeks later that Garrett Becker came back up the hill. He came alone this time. No wagon of scrap lumber. No warnings about collapse and moisture and weight. He came with a small notebook in his hand. He stopped outside the low entrance and stood quietly for a moment, the way a man does when the words he has come to say are hard ones. "I know how to build walls," he said at last. Then he held up the notebook. "But I came to learn how to keep heat." There was no bitterness in his voice. None of the old certainty either. Only honesty, plain and humble, the kind that costs a proud man something to offer. Maren Holloway looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and stepped aside and let him in. Over the days that followed, that little notebook began to fill. Not with grand theories, not with the fine mathematics of a learned man, with practical things. Things the storm itself had proven, written in a builder's careful hand. Maren showed him the bed of dark stones and explained why some things drink in the heat and hold it long after the fire is cold, and why a wise person trusts those things above any roaring flame. She showed him how a low ceiling cradles the warmth close, where a high and handsome one only gives it somewhere to escape. She walked him outside and showed him the drainage trenches and explained how the slow creep of moisture destroys a body's comfort long before it ever destroys a wall. And she took him beyond the entrance and showed him the low stone windbreak she had built to guard the chimney, and the curved elbow on the pipe that turned its mouth away from the wind. "The wind isn't your enemy," she told him. "Don't go to war with it. It's just water, looking downhill. It follows the openings, every single time." She looked at him. "So don't give it one." Garrett Becker wrote that down too. The finest builder in the valley, learning to build all over again, at the knee of the widow he had warned would surely fail. Word of it spread before the snow had even begun to melt. And here is the part that mattered most. The part that the old widow herself would never have predicted. On those long, lonely nights when the whole town's laughter was the only company she had. They did not just thank her and forget her. They learned from her. That first spring, families all across Hollow's End began to build differently. Some dug storage rooms back into the hillsides. Some piled earth high against their exposed walls, the way she had taught Garrett. A few copied her drainage trenches almost stone for stone. The changes looked small at first. A bermed wall here. A buried cellar there. A windbreak beside a cabin that had always stood naked to the open country. But they were the beginning of something far larger. Hollow's End was no longer building against the winter the way it always had. The proud way. The certain way. It was learning from it. And it had learned from her. The woman they had laughed at. The widow they had pitied and dismissed and turned away from a low door in the dark. The foolish old thing who had scratched a hole in the frozen ground like an animal too witless to die indoors. They knew better now. When her name was spoken in town that spring, it was not spoken with laughter or with pity. It was spoken the way you speak the name of someone you owe a great deal to. On the first truly warm day of that spring, they came up the hill again, not in a storm this time, not in desperation. They came in the soft gold light of a thawing afternoon, and they came carrying things. Garrett Becker came with a new door he had built for her with his own hands, fitted and hung so tight and true that not a breath of wind could find its way around the edge of it. He would take no payment. He only asked quietly if she would tell him whether he'd gotten it right. She ran her old fingers along the seam, the way she had once watched her husband do, and she told him he had. The big man's face went red with something like pride and something like grief all at once. Delphine came with bread still warm from her oven and color high in her cheeks, and a laugh that rang clear across the hilltop with not a single cough in it. The minister came and stood a little apart, the way ministers do. But before he left, Eliphalet Stowe took the old widow's hand in both of his, and he said simply that he had been wrong about where a decent person belonged, that he had said God gave folks the open sky, and that he had forgotten somehow that God had given them the good deep earth as well. He did not make a sermon of it. He just said it, plain, and meant it. And the boy came. The same boy who had ducked through her doorway on a flimsy excuse about a lost goat and felt the warm stones and said it was like summer had come down to hide. He was a little taller now. He brought her nothing but himself and 100 questions. And he sat by the entrance with Ember's gray head in his lap and asked her to explain, all over again, how a fire that was out could still keep a body warm. So she explained it. She explained it to all of them that warm spring afternoon, sitting at the mouth of the hill that had saved them, not as a lesson, as a gift. She showed them the stones and the trenches and the low curved ceiling, the same things she had shown Garrett, but slower now, and with more of herself in it. Because she understood, finally, that she was not just teaching them how to keep a house warm. She was teaching them how to look at the world a little more humbly, how to stop being so sure, how to listen to the cold instead of fighting it, and to the people the rest of the world had stopped listening to. And as she talked and they listened, the old widow felt the strangest thing. She felt useful. After so long believing she was finished, after so long being the poor thing, the ragged widow, the one folks lowered their voices around, to sit in the spring sun and have the whole valley lean in close to hear what she had to say. It was a kind of warmth no fire had ever given her, and that, more than any warmth the stones had ever given back, was the thing that finally thawed the long cold winter in Maren Holloway's own chest. For she had believed for so long that her life was over, that a woman alone, old and poor, with nothing but a dog and a grief too heavy to carry, had nothing left to offer anyone. The town had believed it too. They had decided she was finished, and they had been kind about it, in the way that is almost worse than cruelty. And they had all been wrong. She had not been finished at all. She had simply been waiting for the world to grow cold enough to need what she alone had learned. The years moved on, the way they do. The valley changed. Here and there, green earthen roofs began to appear along the slopes, soft mounds of living grass over the warm hollows beneath, bermid walls, buried rooms, windbreaks where there had once been only naked, shivering cabins. The winters still came. They always would. But they no longer took what they used to take. Children grew up in Hollow's End knowing in their bones the things their parents had learned too late and at too high a price. And much of what they knew could be traced back, if anyone cared to follow the thread, to a quiet woman and a hill that nobody had wanted. Maren Holloway grew old on that hill, older than she had ever expected to. The hard years had carved her, but the warm ones, the years that came after, softened her again in their own way. She was not alone in them. That was the gift she had never seen coming. The Beckers came often, Delphine with color in her cheeks and breath in her lungs, and a laugh that the cold had nearly stolen for good. The minister's daughter, the little girl whose toes had gone blue, grew up into a young woman who climbed the hill on her own two strong legs to sit with the old woman who had saved her, though she had been too small that night to remember any of it. And Thaddeus Crane, the proud man, came too, in the end, not as the richest man in the valley, just as a man who had once sat beside a small fire in the dark and finally set down a weight he had carried for 30 years. They never spoke again of that night, the two of them. They didn't need to. But he was there on the cold evenings, often as not. Sitting beside her at the mouth of the hill, the two of them watching the smoke rise, two old people who had lost someone to the same patient enemy and found, late in their lives, that the warmth shared between two survivors is a kind of warmth all its own. And through all those years, there was Ember, the old dog who had started it all, the half-blind, gray-muzzled creature who had scratched at frozen ground while everyone else saw nothing but worthless dirt. He grew old alongside her. The gray spread across his face until there was little dark left in it. His walks grew shorter. His naps grew longer. He moved slow and careful, and he spent most of his days dozing near the warm stones in the place that he had, in his own way, found first. But whenever the snow came down over the valley, the old dog still liked to lie near the doorway, right at the mouth of the hill, in the spot where, on a bitter morning long ago, his stubborn digging had opened a door that no one else could see, and one winter morning, he did not wake. There was no struggle, no suffering, only stillness. The same deep, gentle stillness that had filled the hill on that very first evening, when Maren had stood in the unfinished dark and understood, for the first time, that the wind could no longer reach her. She knelt beside him a long while. She did not cry, not right away. She simply rested her cracked old hand on his gray side, where the breath no longer rose and fell, and she stayed with him the way he had stayed with her through all the long, cold years. "There now," she whispered to him at last. The same words she had said the night the smoke nearly took him. "There now, you rest." That afternoon, she carried him outside. The ground near the entrance was frozen, but never as deeply as the cruel, hard prairie beyond it. The hill kept its own warmth, even here, so she dug, slow and steady, the way she had dug everything in this place. With her own two hands, she buried him right where the first hole had appeared, where his paws had scratched at the frozen earth all those years ago, while the whole world saw nothing there at all, where the story had started. It felt right. It was the only place that could have felt right. But here is the thing Maren Holloway had not expected. She did not bury him alone. By the time she had finished, they had come up the hill, quietly, without being asked, the Beckers, the minister and his wife, the grown girl who had once been a freezing child on those warm stones, Thaddeus Crane, leaning on a cane now, his proud back bent with years. Half the valley, it seemed, they had heard, the way a close-knit place hears things. And they had come, through the snow, up the hill they had once mocked, to stand beside the old woman as she laid her oldest friend to rest. No one made speeches. That was not the way of it. They simply stood with her, in the cold and the white, around a small grave at the mouth of a hill that had saved every one of them. And Maren Holloway, who had spent the hardest winter of her life utterly alone, who had believed with her whole heart that she had nothing left and no one to share it with, stood now surrounded by the living warmth of people who would not let her grieve by herself. That was the moment she understood how much had changed. Not the hill, not the stones, not the clever tricks of keeping warmth that she had taught half the valley. Her. She had dug down into the cold, dark earth in the worst season of her grief, looking only for a way to survive one more winter. And somewhere down in that dark, without ever meaning to, she had dug her way back into the world of the living. She had gone underground a discarded old widow, alone and forgotten. And she had come back up something else, entirely. Something the valley needed. Something it loved. She looked down at the small grave and then around at the faces gathered close in the snow. The children of the children she had saved, peeking out from behind their mother's coats. The proud man, humbled and kind. The builder, who called her teacher now. Her eyes were wet at last, but not only with grief. He heard it before I did, she said softly, to all of them and to none of them. Her hand rested on the frozen mound. The warmth, the way down out of the cold. A small, trembling smile touched her face. He always was the smart one. A few of them laughed gently. A few of them wept. It was that kind of moment. The wind moved soft across the hill. It did not bite. It did not hunt. It only passed over the warm earth and the gathered people and moved on, the way the wind does, looking for some other place to test. It would not find a way in here. She had seen to that long ago. In the years that followed, children who had not even been born during that great storm grew up playing on the green grassy roof above the hill. They ran across it in the summers, laughing, never once knowing they were standing on the most important shelter the whole valley had ever raised. Sometimes one of them would stop and notice the small worn stone near the doorway and ask why there was a grave on the hill. And sometimes a child would ask why the hill had a door at all. And the older folks would always smile before they answered, because by then, the story belonged to all of them. It had stopped being the tale of one strange old widow and become something the whole community carried together, the way they carried the memory of the warmth she had shown them. They would tell the children about a hard winter, long ago, about a woman everyone had given up on, about an old dog that dug where no one else thought to look, and about how the safest place in the whole valley, on the coldest night anyone could remember, turned out to be a hole in the ground that belonged to the one person they had thrown away. On cold evenings, even long after she was gone, folks would still glance up toward the hill and see that thin ribbon of smoke rising into the winter sky. Someone always kept the place warm. It had become a thing they did in Hollow's End, a way of remembering, a small thing, easy to miss. And somehow, it always made the cold a little easier to bear, because they knew what it meant. It meant that no one is ever truly finished, that the ones the world gives up on may be carrying the very thing the world will someday need most. That warmth, real warmth, is not the kind you buy or burn. It is the kind you choose to give on the coldest night to the people who least deserve it and need it most. The hill stood through all the winters that came after. The lesson stayed buried inside it, warm and patient, the same as it had always been, waiting the way the old woman once waited, for the next soul willing to stop fighting the cold and learn instead to keep the warmth